As you might know, George Soros is a central figure in the late political developments for several reasons in Hungary. Soros was, just briefly to introduce whoever might not be very familiar with the figure, he was a Hungarian refugee, a Holocaust survivor who fled the country shortly after the Second World War in 1947, earned a degree in economics in London, and then moved forward to the US, where he was a stockbroker for a decade, later setting up a hedge fund and making an astonishing fortune on it, resulting in the position of the 29th wealthiest person in the world right now, at least according to Forbes. From the 90s on, he would spend tremendous sums on supporting civic initiatives and promising individuals in the democratic transitions in the Soviet sphere, within which, undeniably, Hungary was the apple of his eye. Viktor Orban, one of these promising youth leaders, was a Soros scholarship beneficiary himself, and so was his party, Fidesz, now in government, provided with a sum of 3 million forints in 1989 for networking, for national network building. This would be somewhere between 2,000 and 330,000 euros today. So quite a huge sum in Hungarian terms. Orbán and his party seemed like a revolting generational group deeply involved in the transformation of Hungarian political culture at the time, with a fresh, cheeky liberalism, a crisp anti-Russian take, and a touch of feminism and progressive youth politics. But pretty soon, already by the middle of the 90s, they took a conservative turn. They called it bürgerlich. I would call it neoconservative, and started to operate a rhetoric that relies strongly on the cultural heritage of the oppressive Horthy regime between the two world wars. Orbán was in government between 1998 and 2002, from which most of his late malice was already predictable. They were corrupted and exclusive, nationalistic and pompous, fiscally and socially unreasonable, and demanding ever more power. It's not that much of a surprise. They fell painfully in 2002, and 2 cycles of socialist government came, highly endorsed by the fear of Orbán coming back to power. They operated the lesser evil argument, as so did, for instance, Democrats after Bush in the US. Yet they were highly corrupted themselves, the socialists, and although culturally less conflictious in their operation, actually quite repressive, or at least ignorant towards social issues and initiatives, resistant to social consultation, feeding on EU structural funds. As one chief sociologist summed up, the main difference between those, the socialists, and these, Orbán's troop, is that those would be disorganized, but these ones still in a disciplined unison. They were neoliberals with corrupted manners. That's it. After the collapse of 2 socialist governments and the Socialist Party itself going down in a huge governmental crisis, Orbán came to power in 2010, and the attacks against independent civil society, academic freedom, and the independent press started right away. They occupied all state agencies and built a Kaiser-fashion strict regime of obedience and started to take out on everyone not owned or ruled by them. There have been rhetoric campaigns against Brussels, against the utility bills. The infamous utility war was declared on actually energy prices. The migrants who happen to be asylum seekers, the Norwegian-funded NGOs, and yet lately George Soros and everyone is supported by his institutions or supposedly supported. Let us start with Lex KGB. The existence of the Central European University has been threatened this spring when the government introduced a legislation of highly technicalized details that would disable the CEU to operate as a foreign university in Budapest. They would require any foreign higher education institution to have a campus in their homeland and or an international agreement of governments on their operation and so on and so forth. It is clearly fashioned to stop the operation of CEU. This attempt to close down the CEU was clearly encouraged by the election of Donald Trump in the US. However, the Trump administration did not back up Orbán in his plan to take down the shiniest gemstone of George Soros' legacy. Attacking the CEU was clearly a political miscalculation. International solidarity rose up all around the globe, also in Vienna. Thank you for your support, by the way, whoever was there. And backed up this highest ranked university of the region, and so did huge masses of protesters throughout Hungary, in the capital and also in many other cities. Although Orbán stated that no one even knows what the CEU was, people seem to have rather done so, or at least having had serious notion of the importance of academic freedom and autonomy. Instead of analyzing Orbán's supposed Oedipal complex towards his formal stepfather George Soros, which is often voiced by many, a theory I find kind of appealing but rather silly, I would frame these attacks as a consistent attempt to either annex or annihilate every entity that acts independently in an even close to political way. I do not deny that demonizing Soros has a strong touch of anti-Semitism and is part of an all-around Kulturkampf against the notion of the open society, but I do state that this is none of a personal issue. CEU, for instance, has been often named the most precious piece of George Soros's legacy, but it is also the last one standing among Hungarian universities, which still kept its autonomy. Founded and funded by Soros and other non-state dependent sources, CEU has been able to maintain its autonomy, unlike all public universities in the country who have completely and definitively lost their autonomies 3 years ago, as since 2014, chancellors are appointed by the government to single-handedly govern higher education institutions. The chancellors are equals with the rectors in theory. In practice, they have a say in every decision, be it hiring or buying printing paper, whatever you'd say. There are many depressing factors around this institution. Not only that the government has direct say in university leadership, which is obviously horrible, but let me also note the fact that the Rectoral Conference did nothing more but released one single statement problematizing the proposal, but never took an actual stand against it. And I'm talking about political stances. Neither did they take any serious stance in the case of the Lex EU. First, they declared they wish not to get involved in political debates, and later, this April, released a statement on their worries and problematized they weren't involved in the decision-making process. It's not much of a resistance. And this is not much of a surprise for all those who had seen them in action since 2006. Let me disturb you with the fact that the institution of the Chancellor was first initiated by a socialist government back in 2006. Against that, and also against the planned introduction of tuition fees and the severe cuts in higher education budgets, was funded the Students' Network, an informal group of university activists, myself among them, and we started to organize for protests and serious discourse. Yet, instead, on the day of an officially announced and approved debate at the Department of Humanities at Loránd Eötvös Science University in Budapest, our campus was evacuated and closed down just a few hours before the roundtable discussion was supposed to start. One insider even said that the university CFO at a meeting voiced his fear of a possible 4,000 anarchists tearing down the lamps of the auditorium. Let me note that I suppose in the past 200 years there haven't been 4,000 anarchists in the whole region altogether. We were 40 who showed up. So I'm 100 anarchists, by the way. Similarly, in 2010 and 2011, when the Students' Network started to organize way more seriously, they organized talks and protests against the Orbán government's planned strikes on universities, mingling with the finances, cutting funds, declaring total war on entire departments and ripping universities of their autonomy. Another few campuses were closed down to exclude the activists. Later, when students started occupying auditoriums without formal announcements, deans would be freaked out and trying to make deals with them to reduce their presence. They were way more scared of their own students, their own university citizens actually, than of the government just taking them down. The media department at ELTE, Eötvös Loránd Science University of Budapest, was a serious ally for the students since 2006. They were declared the workshop of anarchy. The students' union did not bother about these issues. Their maximum of a complaint was that, once again, they would have wished to be involved in the decision making. Similarly, but even more cruelly, it went down with independent NGOs. The first Orbán government from 1998 was already openly hostile to them. But the following socialist government did not do very much better either. They were rejecting involving NGOs in public consultations or biasing them, pushing for exclusion of actors involved in social, environmental, human rights, or local initiatives, and in fact, they did use the Government Bureau for Inspection to block NGOs in their work. This one bureau has for long been called the fist of the government for quite a reason, and later on became one of Orbán's major weapons to paralyze civic organizations with overwhelming inspections. But Orbán and his troop were even more thorough than that. They didn't simply launch investigations for no reason. When Fidesz came back to power in 2010 with a 2/3 majority in parliament that enables them to do practically anything, they declared a regime of national cooperation with a proclamation that needed to be hung in all public institutions, starting with the biblical declaration, "May there be peace, freedom, and compliance." The constitution was soon replaced by an entirely new piece of text they called the base law and consulted on with precisely nobody. European Parliament member József Szájer even bragged about having written it on his iPad. Among many other concerns, let me draw your attention to the fact that this document, in this document, the country is no longer called a republic anymore. Now it is solely Hungary, which used to be a Hungarian republic before. Soon, they changed the NGO law completely in 2011. Some mistakes of the former legislation they did indeed fix, but the major change was devastating. They disassembled the former National Civic Fund and replaced it with the National Cooperation Fund, which by its name already states what it requires from its beneficiaries. The head of this fund, László Csizmadia, also the leader of a so-called Forum of Civic Alliance, supposedly an umbrella organization, but in effect a government propaganda brigade that organized so-called peace marches to support the government. Many NGOs, among the most human rights, social rights, and otherwise oppositional initiatives, lost all state funding in this process, and all the financial resources that remained for them on open calls within the country was the Norwegian Civic Fund. This is a portion of the Norwegian funds that are provided by Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway in return of the favors they enjoy as members of the European Economic Area. These are complementary to the EU structural funds and provided to the less developed members of the area, among them Hungary. But whereas the development funds were handled by the states, the civic funds were handled by a consortium of independent foundations which have had quite a history in running grant programs. Originally, they were set up to distribute Marshall funds and Rockefeller funds in the 90s at the regime change. This four-member consortium, led by Environmental Partnership Foundation, gave grants to many organizations disfavored by the government precisely on the basis of the Norway Grants Delegation to support human rights advocacy, social innovations, and grassroots organizing of various fields. From 2013 on, government-friendly news outlets would start a propaganda campaign against organizations they labeled as of foreign interest, and the government communication turned on them gradually. Within half a year, in spring 2014, Prime Minister's office claims a political influence. Sorry, I just got caught up in my own linguistic structure. So in 2014 spring, the Prime Minister's office claims that political influence is sensible in the EEA and Norway grants, and soon the suspension of the grants are requested from Norway. A state audit was launched against the fund operator and the beneficiaries of the Norway grants, yet in return, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein suspended the state-operated development funds, but kept the civic grant operations running. Later on, a court ruling revealed the audit, the government audit, was personally ordered by the Prime Minister. On the 8th of September 2014, a police raid occupied the office of Grant Operator Environmental Partnership Foundation and also the personal country home of Zsuzsa Foltányi, the former CEO of the foundation. Current CEO Veronika Mora was brought in for questioning by the police. Documents of blacklisted NGOs were seized. Lengthy tax investigations and government inspections started right away and took up to 2 years at many NGOs, and all ended without a result. One very confrontative organization of a cultural and educational profile, Chalk Circle Foundation, named after the Bertolt Brecht play, of course, was inspected twice in a row with no breaks in between and of the same time period. They were feeding papers to the tax authorities for 2 entire years, spent over 1,600 labor hours to let the obvious be proven. Their operation was all legal and in order, as they have already published all their figures every year, as an NGO should. But by 2016, the Norwegian fund-supported programs already ended and a new enemy was dragged out of the gutter. And here we come, this is George Soros, closely the Open Society foundations we're talking about. The story shall be familiar. In May 2016, OSF-funded NGOs were blacklisted. In June, a suspicious device, probably for surveillance, was found in the office of Akin, one of the organizations in question. And this year, another full-blown offensive started against NGOs. First initiative was to force NGO personnel to state their assets, but this plan was dropped due to difficulties with EU law harmonization. Yet instead, another propaganda campaign of billboards and government ads started to smear NGOs as if they were serving alien interests. After much fuss, back and forth, last week the parliament finally voted on the bill we call Lex NGO, but I suggest we rather call it Lex KGB, since it is fashioned directly after the legislation Vladimir Putin introduced in Russia in 2012. This piece labels organizations who receive more than a certain amount of funding from abroad as foreign agents, requires them to register themselves and display the little yellow star on their surfaces and publications. A similar law is in effect in Israel as well, also directed partly at Open Society funded independent NGOs. So since last week, I am also officially a foreign agent. The good thing is that in the Bond movies, since Orbán is allies with Putin, I assume I'm Money Penny from MI5. There are mass protests and initiatives in Hungary to counter these regulations and offenses, but our job is not an easy one. Press freedom has been threatened as early as of 2010, when the new media law was announced, and movements have been organizing ever since for freedom of speech and press freedom, for public education and higher education, to counter corruption of the tax authorities, to stop the planned internet tax, to back up NGOs, the CEU, and also newspapers that have been shut down. Right now, a majority of Hungarian media outlets are either directly state-run or owned and ordered by people close to the government. Media ownership concentration scores at risk as high as 68%. Political control over media outlets is counted to be in risk at 75%. Editorial autonomy is at risk of 88%, according to the Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom. State advertisements are dominating the finances of these outlets. Others who did not go down by themselves were either decapitated or simply shut down. Last fall, the most sold daily print, Népszabadság, the Hungarian Pravda, published a series of articles uncomfortable for the Minister of Propaganda, Antal Rogán, and next Saturday, all employees woke up to motorcycle couriers delivering letters in which their employments were suspended. The news site and its archives were washed off the internet, and the paper never published ever again. I mean, who does that? Yet, despite local newspapers and commercial TV channels also being bought up by Viktor Orban's next door neighbor and other suspicious figures, the readers and viewers do not keep their interest in these propagandized mediums. Rather, they abandon them quite quickly instead. Strong patterns of disbelief in propaganda are rooted in the Soviet times and even way before the Habsburg monarchy. A counterculture of reading between the lines and ignoring state communication does get in effect, even if many people, especially in the poor regions and in the countryside, may not reach any independent media at all. This could be realized this quickly and easily precisely because the mainstream media has always been strongly dependent on state advertisements even before 2010. Not only did they not run on market logic, but neither did they engage with their readership. A huge and malicious gap was kept up between print and online media, a generational conflict between those who established their positions back in the 90s and those emerging later and standing for innovation. A journalist at ORF just asked me today what went wrong ever since Hungary quit the Soviet repression and was wishing to head towards Austria, because this was the saying in the 90s. We are going to reach Austria. I would say among many factors, one may wish to remind themselves of the catastrophic events at the end of the 90s, which are highly underrepresented in mainstream media, I suppose. In 1998, the Russian stock market collapsed, and so did the markets that a huge portion of Hungarian economy was serving, especially agriculture and the processed food industry, which are particularly interesting because a lot of other means of industry have already been in collapse or already collapsed by then after the regime change. Orbán first came to power in 1999, precisely when this collapse happened, and was very resistant to rebuilding the Russian relations, and appointed a minister of agriculture who was a bit more witty yet equally horrible foreshadow of a Donald Trump. Like really, like Donald Trump is no news for us. We've had that 20 years ago. Multinational corporations started to enter the retail market at the same exact time. I'm not going to argue against the wicked multis who robbed on us. I would say that the point where they entered the Hungarian market was a very vulnerable one. Most state monopoly assets such as telecommunication and the building industry were already privatized by then. Many who lost their positions then never gained them back, and those who stayed in power at the time, be it at newspapers, television, radio stations, or in industry positions, or in political administrative positions, well, they held on to it. So the generational continuity was blocked, I suggest, partly because of this crisis. And those who stuck in power, they resisted technological, methodological improvements very fiercely. In 2004, Hungary joined the EU and signed agreements that were known to subordinate the local economy as a semi-peripheral market, dooming a huge portion of family businesses and farms, favoring bigger actors. Modernization, we would say back then. The media market was also cut up between publishers like Springer, Ringier, and Bertelsmann, selling and buying back and forth. On the semi-peripheral position, one may wish to rather read people who are way more knowledgeable on that. I suggest you read Tamás Gerőcs and András Pinkas, economists, who can provide you with way more data than I know myself. Let me also mention that the EU funds also provided resources to NGOs since we joined the EU, but their structure contributed to the instrumentalization and the weakening of the sphere, even though they were actually giving money. First things first, these funds were operated by the governments, thus taking directions in favor of those in power. Secondly, but importantly, these funding mechanisms required extreme administrative apparatus, thus pushing organizations into a very bureaucratized, project-based modus operandi that cut their way from their original dedications and constituency, and just were stocked up in their efforts in tremendous paperwork. These funds have long been criticized by fellow grantmakers and social scientists, journalists specializing in development policies, who found that these policies pictured the civic sphere as a politically neutral, almost service-providing agency complementary to the state, taking up its tasks and performing professional work the nation-states themselves are less likely to take care of. It was a big school of social outsourcing. Grant application at times would even require organizations to prove they have no links with political organizations or politicians whatsoever, thus sending a strong message of neoliberal multiculturalism. Keep your angles, but quit your advocacy. You can have cultural rights, but you don't have political rights. Strikes of the Orbán regime hit the Hungarian civic sector in a state when it was already tied up in this misery and trying to take a professional turn. We all have weak moments, I know, but it was rather a weak decade when the first lightning struck. Right now, the EU is threatening Orbán with sanctions, but we have seen no more than a raising of an eyebrow and some bit of a withdrawal from even that. Although I believe not that some Occidental daddy EU should be supposed to make order in our country, I suggest that the impotence of this federation is encouraging to the illiberal regimes. Movements and protests are being organized. New political formations are coming to the fore. Orbán does not have the favor of an extended votership. Rather, a huge portion of voters have dropped out of voting in lack of worthy opponents. Just to make it clear how very supported Orbán is, one should keep in mind that in 2010 he gained 2/3 majority in the parliament with less votes than he lost with in 2006. And this last 2/3 majority he won in 2014, they were even less votes than in 2010. So what is happening is that since the Socialist Party completely collapsed, their votership did not join some other group, they just abandoned voting. So once the appropriate opposition parties appear and stronger, Orbán actually can be put out of the way. But we must not forget that in order to deal with this massive mess that was created, since education, healthcare, social systems are not on the collapse, they have already collapsed, and people are just seeking for some air and grasping for some air under the ruins. It is not enough to produce some new selection of consumable political service providers, of whom one shall be chosen and then whatever. No political formulation can save us the effort to politicize this very passive society, which in fact has for long been the least politically engaged, even within this western strip of the former Soviet bloc. Hungarians have a strong and long tradition of disengagement, and this can be traced back to the 18th century at least. Still, without continuous involvement in well-organized mass movements, new political actors can be just as unaccountable as before, and it's just a lottery who wins the elections. Concerned NGOs have also formed an alliance under the name Civilizáció, which you might wish to follow and be informed of. Also, I understand this sounds strange, but I suggest you do not keep calm. Although this whole story might seem uncanny and completely inappropriate to compare to Western European conditions, in the middle of the illiberal turn, I say you better freak out as soon as you can. Neither did we believe when we were watching what's going on in Russia that it would be happening in our country, especially being an EU member state, but it very much can. My strategy, which I suggest, is to freak out as soon as you can. Be alert and panic early. Prepare and be aware. Watch out for your democratic institutions and, more importantly, the public involvement in politics. The sooner you panic, the better you will be able to calm down and act with a cool head in times of battle. And let us hope you will never have to. Thank you for your attention.